Hello. Today's story is one of those that forces even the most hardened skeptics to pause, to question if we truly know everything about the world we inhabit. This is not just another missing person report. This is a story about a discovery so unsettling it became the basis of a classified police file. A story about footprints left in the snow that, to this day, no forensic scientist has been able to identify. We travel back to January 2000, to the vast, snow-covered forests of northern Michigan. It was a place where a chilling horror proved to be far more real and far more terrifying than the bitter cold itself. There, amid the absolute silent stillness of the woods, the body of an experienced hunter was found. A body without a head. The only witnesses to his final violent moments were the tracks left in the snow tracks of a creature that moved sometimes on two legs, like a man, and sometimes on four, like a beast. This story begins on Saturday, January 15th, 2000. Our central figure is 47-year-old Richard Collins, an engineer from Grand Rapids. Richard was a man who seemed to have been born out of his time. He was a man who deeply preferred the profound silence of the forest to the chaotic hustle of the big city. He found more meaning in tracking game by its subtle signs than in the familiar routine of an office. For Richard, hunting was not just a hobby. It was a passion, a deeply personal way of connecting with the raw, untamed elements of nature. He knew the Manistee National Forest like the back of his hand. He understood its rhythms, its secrets. He knew every trail, every ravine, and every hidden clearing where deer or elk were likely to be found. His wife, Carol Collins, would later tell investigators that Richard could disappear into those woods for hours on end, and he would always return either with prey or, at the very least, with stories of what he would seen. He was not a reckless man. He was, in fact, extremely cautious, a true professional who never took unnecessary risks. His preparation was meticulous. He always carried everything he needed: his powerful Remington 700 rifle, a reliable radio tuned to the emergency frequency, and a fully stocked survival kit. He was, in every sense of the word, an expert. That Saturday morning was like any other. As usual, he kissed his wife goodbye, the cold morning air misting their breath. He promised to be back by sunset, just as he always was. The weather was perfect for a winter hunt. A light, dry frost gripped the air, with the temperature holding steady around 10 degrees Celsius. Most importantly, a fresh, untouched blanket of snow had fallen the night before. For a man like Richard, this was ideal. The forest was a blank page, ready to be read. Every track would be sharp and clear. Carol began to worry when the clock on the mantelpiece struck 7 inches the evening. The sun had long since plunged below the horizon, plunging the world outside into a deep frozen darkness. Richard's old pickup truck had not yet appeared on the driveway. At first, she dismissed her fears. She reasoned with herself. Richard was an experienced hunter. He could have easily gotten carried away, pushing just a little further while chasing an animal, and simply lost track of time. He could be waiting patiently in an ambush, still and silent, letting the forest settle around him. But as 7 p.m. bled into 8 and then 9, and the radio in the house remained deathly silent, her anxiety began to curdle into real, palpable fear. In the year 2000, cell phone coverage in these remote forest areas was virtually non-existent. The radio was their only lifeline, the only way to contact her husband. She picked up the handset again and again, calling his name into the void. Her calls were answered only by the dead, empty hiss of static. At 10 p.m., unable to bear the crushing weight of the tension any longer, Carol Collins picked up the phone and dialed the Manistee County Sheriff's Office. The officer on duty took the call, his voice calm and procedural. But he immediately explained the harsh reality of the situation. A full-scale search, in the dead of night, in a dense forest with freezing temperatures and deep snow, would be far too dangerous for the rescuers themselves. He assured Mrs. Collins that the first team, fully equipped, would be on site at the first light of dawn. Carol spent that long, sleepless night staring out the dark window, listening to every groan of the house, every rustle of the wind, desperately hoping to hear the familiar rumble of a pickup truck approaching. But the only sound was the silence of the snow-covered woods, which seemed to have swallowed her husband whole. At the first hint of gray light on Sunday, January 16th, the search operation began. The air was frigid, still, and heavy with anticipation. Richard's pickup truck was found quickly, almost exactly where Carol had presumed it would be. It was parked at one of the unofficial entrances to the forest, a small unmarked pull-off, often used by local hunters who knew the area's backways. The truck was cold, the engine long dead, and a fresh layer of frost covered the windshield. But next to the driver's side door, pressed clearly into the pristine snow, were ski tracks. They were Richard's tracks. They led straight from the truck into the dense line of trees, the grooves smooth and confident. He had set off on his hunt just as planned. The search party, a grim-faced group consisting of 2 deputy sheriffs and several volunteer hunters who knew the local terrain, set off on the trail. The mood was one of quiet concern, but not yet alarm. Everyone there knew Richard Collins. They knew his skill. The most likely scenario, they told each other, was a fall, a broken leg, or severe hypothermia. They just needed to find him, and find him fast. The first few miles raised no immediate concerns. The tracks were steady, cutting a clean line through the untouched snow. They showed that the man was not in a hurry, moving at a hunter's pace, pausing frequently, his head likely scanning the trees and ridges around him. He was clearly tracking game, doing what he loved. The trail led them deeper into the forest's embrace, over frozen creeks and through stands of silent birch trees. But after about 3 miles, as the team navigated a dense patch of hemlock, they came across the first strange circumstance. To the left of the ski trail, about 20 meters away under a large pine, lay a dark shape against the snow. It was the carcass of a large male deer. At first glance, this was nothing unusual for a winter forest. It could have been a wolf kill, or an animal that had succumbed to the cold. But one of the volunteers, an old hunter named Bob with decades of experience in these woods, moved in for a closer look. He stopped, dead in his tracks. His breath plumed in the air as he motioned silently for the others. The deer was dead, but it was not from a gunshot. Its neck and side had been torn apart with a ferocity that was shocking to behold. This was not the work of a pack of wolves. Wolves are efficient, but they are also messy in a specific way, leaving multiple bite marks as they tear at their prey from different angles. This was different, nor did it look like a bear attack. The wounds were ragged, clean tears in the hide, as if someone had dug massive, hooked claws deep into the flesh and simply ripped out chunks of meat with incredible, singular force. But the strangest thing, the detail that made Bob's blood run cold, was that most of the carcass remained untouched. The predator had not killed for hunger. It had not fed. It had simply killed. Bob would later state in his official report that in 40 years of hunting, he had never seen anything like it. It was not predation. It was a senseless, violent rampage. The searchers exchanged worried, uneasy glances. A new, unspoken tension settled over the group. They looked back at Richard's ski trail. It passed by the dead deer. And just as they suspected, the tracks showed he had seen it too. His skis, which had been moving in a steady rhythm, stopped for a moment. The snow compressed where he had stood, staring at the grisly scene. And then the trail continued, but it was different now. The pace was faster, the strides longer. It seemed this discovery had made him deeply alert, perhaps even afraid. He was no longer walking slowly, tracking his prey. Now, he was moving purposefully and quickly, as if he was either retreating or moving towards something specific. The team unslung their own rifles from their shoulders, their casual search mission now feeling very, very different. The search party followed Richard's quickened ski tracks for another half-mile. The forest grew denser here, the trees thicker, blocking out more and more of the weak morning light. The trail led the group toward a small, snow-covered clearing, completely encircled by a wall of dense, towering pine trees. And it was here, in this silent, enclosed space, that the scene which met their eyes silenced even the most hardened and experienced searchers. Richard Collins's ski trail, which they had been following so diligently, ended abruptly right in the middle of the clearing. It just stopped. And all around that final point was a scene of what one of the officers would later describe in his report as pure, incomprehensible chaos. Richard's skis were scattered, one jammed upright in a snowdrift as if kicked aside with tremendous force. Nearby, his Remington 700 rifle lay in the snow. But it was not intact. The rifle, a high-powered weapon with a thick laminated wooden stock, was broken in half. The stock had been snapped clean through, like a dry matchstick. Even more disturbing, the heavy steel barrel was bent at a grotesque, unnatural angle. The deputies, all familiar with firearms, stared at it in disbelief. It would take a truly superhuman, almost mechanical, amount of force to do that to a weapon made of hardened steel. It was simply not possible. A few feet away lay the tattered remains of Richard's backpack. It had been torn to shreds, its contents a thermos, spare ammunition, a first aid kit flung and scattered across the snow. One of his heavy winter gloves lay nearby, half buried. The snow around this central point was horribly trampled, but not in the way it would be if two men had been fighting. A human struggle leaves a messy but understandable pattern of scuffs, boot prints, and depressions. This was something else entirely. It was a zone of pure, focused violence. It was as if a whirlwind had touched down in this one small spot, fixated on Richard, and then vanished. The team's leader, a gray-haired and imperturbable veteran of 20 years, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not a hunting accident. This was not an animal attack. This was a slaughter. The deputies fanned out, their boots crunching in the deathly quiet clearing. Their eyes moved from the shattered rifle to the shredded backpack, and then, inevitably, to the snow itself. Amidst Richard's own desperate boot prints, which were kicked and smeared, other tracks were visible. Tracks that made the blood run cold in the veins of everyone present. They were the prints of huge, bare feet. Not boots, feet. They measured about 14 inches long, roughly 35 centimeters, but their shape was completely and chillingly abnormal. The heel was unnaturally narrow, while the front of the foot was wide, splayed with long toes. And at the end of each toe, a deep, sharp mark was imprinted in the frozen ground, a mark from a claw digging in for traction. Whatever this was, it had stood there on two legs, towering over Richard Collins. Two distinct chains of these footprints were visible in the trampled snow. The distance between the steps was enormous, almost 2 meters, which spoke to the incredible height and explosive strength of the creature that had left them. But that was not the most frightening thing. The most frightening thing was that in some places, the tracks changed. The bipedal, human-like gait suddenly and inexplicably gave way to four-legged prints. The rear paw prints were joined by front paw prints, which looked similar to those of a huge dog or a massive wolf, but again, they bore those same eerie long fingers and terminated in those terrifying claws. The searchers stared, trying to process the impossible information before them. This creature, whatever it was, could apparently move like a man and then drop down to move like an animal. It was a biological impossibility, yet the proof was right there, pressed into the snow. A deep furrow, a drag mark, stretched across the clearing, starting from the spot where the rifle had been broken. It looked as if something incredibly heavy had been seized and dragged bodily across the ground, cutting a trough through the snow. Next to this furrow was a fresh chain of those monstrous tracks, now only on two legs again. It was walking, and it was dragging its victim. One of the deputy sheriffs, a young man who was on his first major search operation, could not take it. He turned away, stumbled, and threw up into the snow. The team leader, a gray-haired and imperturbable veteran, swallowed hard, his face pale. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was uncharacteristically tense and quiet. He reported that they had found the site of an alleged attack and were now following a drag trail that led deeper into the forest. He deliberately did not go into detail about the nature of the tracks over the open channel. He simply said, "Send the coroner here." and tell the sheriff to come himself. He needs to see this." The group, now with their weapons off safe and held at the ready, slowly moved to follow the furrow in the snow. They peered into the dark, oppressive thicket, every sense screaming. It felt as if something ancient, something that had no place in the modern world, was watching them from just beyond the trees. The search party followed the drag trail for about 50 yards. It was 50 yards of absolute, ringing silence, broken only by the sharp crunch of their own boots in the frozen snow and their heavy breathing, which escaped in white clouds of steam. The forest here was denser, more primeval. Centuries-old pines stood so close together that they formed a canopy, almost completely blocking out the weak daylight and creating an oppressive, cold gloom. The furrow in the snow, left by the dragged body, led them straight to the foot of a large, snow-covered boulder that jutted from the earth like a dark tooth. And there the trail ended. What they saw next remained etched in each of their memories forever, a scene that would revisit them in sleepless nights for years to come. Richard Collins's body lay on its side, leaning unnaturally against the rock as if it had been discarded. His bright orange hunting vest, designed to be seen, was torn to useless shreds, exposing his chest. 3 deep parallel wounds were visible on his torso. They were not bites, and they were not cuts from any blade. The edges of the wounds were jagged, torn, as if giant claws had dug deep into his flesh and pulled down with incredible, unstoppable force, tearing muscles and breaking his ribs like dry twigs. The snow beneath the body was soaked with dark, almost black blood, which had frozen in the bitter cold. But that was not the worst of it. The body had been decapitated. Where the neck and head should have been, there was only a gaping, ragged wound. His head was gone, nowhere to be found. One of the volunteers, a young man, recoiled violently and fell onto his back, stifling a scream in his thick glove. The team leader, somehow keeping his composure, barked an order for everyone to stay where they were and not to touch anything. He fumbled for his radio again. This time, there was not a trace of professional calm in his voice. In short, abrupt, shaken phrases, he reported the discovery. Body found. Confirmed victim, Richard Collins. There are signs of violent death, of an extremely unusual nature. I repeat, extremely unusual. He walked a tight circle around the site, his eyes darting everywhere, carefully examining the traces. The monstrous footprints were everywhere. They surrounded the boulder, converging and diverging, stamping the snow flat in places. It was sickeningly obvious that the creature had not simply killed Collins and dragged him here. It had remained at this spot for some time. What it had been doing, no one could, or wanted to, even guess. An hour later, which felt like an eternity to the shaken search party, the county sheriff and the coroner, Dr. Alan Fairburn, arrived. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man who had worked in law enforcement for over 30 years and thought he had seen everything, stopped 10 feet from the body. He stared at it silently for a long, long time, his gaze shifting from the corpse to the impossible tracks, and then back to the corpse. His face, usually stern and impenetrable, was a mask of pure shock and profound disbelief. The coroner, Dr. Intude Fairburn, a man of science, set to work. His preliminary examination at the scene was brief and grim. He confirmed that death had resulted from massive trauma and decapitation. When the sheriff, his voice low, asked him what kind of animal could have done such a thing, Fairburn, without taking his eyes off the horrific wounds, replied quietly, "Sheriff, none that I ever studied in medical school." He drew the sheriff's attention to the nature of the wound on the neck. It did not resemble a clean cut, like one left by a knife or an axe. The edges were torn, the vertebrae shattered and splintered. It looked, he said, as if the head had been torn off, not cut. Soon, a full forensic team arrived from the county center. They worked slowly, methodically, in a heavy, funereal silence. They photographed every trace, every drop of blood, every scrap of clothing. They paid special, painstaking attention to the footprints. Dozens of plaster casts were made, capturing both the bipedal and quadrupedal prints for later analysis. A thorough grid search of the area within a 100-yard radius yielded no results. Richard Collins's head was gone. It was never found. As the body was being carefully bagged and taken away, one of the officers noticed something else. He called the sheriff over to the trunk of a massive pine tree, back near the clearing where the broken rifle had been found. At a height of about 9 feet, almost 3 meters from the ground, were deep, fresh scratches. 3 parallel grooves had stripped the thick bark away and left gouges in the hardwood itself. He looked at the scratches, then looked at the photos of the wounds on Collins's chest. The pattern matched perfectly. In the days that followed, investigators, scientists, and forensics experts tried to piece together a rational picture of what had happened in that frozen clearing. But the more they analyzed the physical evidence, the more irrational the event became. A firearms expert from the state police was given the remains of Richard Collins's Remington 700 rifle. His official report was short and deeply unsettling. He wrote that to inflict such damage to not only snap the dense laminated stock, but to bend the hardened steel barrel would require a sudden, focused application of force equivalent to several thousand pounds per square inch. He categorically and almost angrily rejected the theory that the rifle could have broken when it hit a tree during a fall. This weapon was broken, the report concluded, as if it had been taken by both ends and bent over a knee, only the knee was made of steel. Dr. Fairbairn's final autopsy report, delivered a week later, was even more disturbing. He officially confirmed his initial findings. The deep lacerations on the chest reached 4 inches, shattering 3 ribs and pushing them inward. The official cause of death was listed as traumatic amputation of the head, but it was in a sealed, classified appendix to the official report, one not intended for the press or public record, that the coroner added his most chilling note. The nature of the damage to the bone and muscle tissue of the cervical spine, he wrote, is incompatible with the predatory patterns of any known animal in North America. Furthermore, the damage does not correspond to that caused by any known cutting or chopping instruments. He had, in professional terms, stated that the head was neither bitten off nor cut off. It was, as he had first suspected, simply torn from the body. But the main, undeniable mystery remained the footprints. The dozens of plaster casts were carefully packaged and sent to the state's leading biologists, zoologists, and even to the FBI's Advanced Forensic Laboratory in Quantico. The answers that came back were as fast as they were discouraging. All the experts, working independently, stated unanimously that these prints did not belong to any known species. It was not a bear. The shape of the foot, the narrow heel, and the long, clawed toes were completely wrong. Not to mention the impossible fluid shift from a 2-legged to a 4-legged gait. It was not a primate. No primate tracks had ever been recorded in Michigan, and the prominent claw marks were anatomically incompatible with any ape. The most logical theory, that of an elaborate human hoax, was also systematically rejected. Forensic analysis of the soil compression, judging by the depth of the footprints in the dense frozen snow, calculated that the creature weighed at least 400 to 500 pounds, around 200 kilograms. No human, even one wearing specially designed and weighted snowshoes, could reproduce that combination of mass, pressure, and the unique, abnormal footprint pattern. The final conclusion from the FBI's experts was dry, concise, and terrifying in its implications. The origin of the tracks has not been established. With no rational answers and a body of evidence that pointed to the impossible, the official response became one of containment. The press was told a simplified, palatable story. Richard Collins had been the victim of an unfortunate encounter with an unusually large and aggressive black bear that had inexplicably come out of hibernation. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources, under pressure, even organized a demonstration hunt for the supposed man-eating bear, an act of political theater that of course yielded no results. The Richard Collins case was quietly closed, the official file stamped with the anticlimactic wording, "hunting accident." But in the small towns and logging communities surrounding the Manistee forest, people knew. They knew it was not a bear. Whispers, old and dark, began to spread again among the old lumberjacks, the seasoned hunters, and the indigenous people of those lands, the Ottawa. They recalled the old stories, Stories that their grandfathers had told their fathers, and their fathers had told them. Stories about a creature that comes with the first heavy snow, a creature that walks on two legs, with the body of a man, but the head of a massive, snarling wolf or dog. It was called by many names in their traditions, but the one that had stuck, the one that made the children shiver, was the Dogman. For decades, it was considered just a local horror story. Campfire folklore fueled by random reports of strange sightings, and a famous spooky song recorded on a local radio station back in the 80s. It was a legend for tourists. But after January 2000, no one in those woods was laughing anymore. And that is where the official story ends. But the real story, the one whispered in hushed tones over bar counters and around campfires, was just beginning. What happened next was a quiet, invisible war between the official, sanitized version and the terrifying, inconvenient truth. Richard's widow, Carol Collins, never for a second accepted the conclusion that it was a bear attack. In numerous, though largely ignored, interviews with small local newspapers, she repeated the same simple, unshakable facts. Rick was no novice, she insisted, her voice raw with grief and frustration. He knew the habits of bears better than anyone. He would have heard it. He would have smelled it. He would never have let an animal get that close. And his rifle. He cleaned it after every hunt. He cared for it like a child. The idea that a bear could just snap it like a twig is absurd. They are lying to me. They are lying to all of us. Her attempts to get the case reopened, to have the impossible evidence properly investigated, were met with a wall of polite but impenetrable bureaucratic refusal. For the authorities, the case was closed. The story was over. But not for everyone. One of the lead investigators on the case, a detective whose name we cannot mention, could not let it go. He could not sleep, haunted by the image of the tracks and the broken rifle. A few months before his transfer to another state, a transfer many believed was not a promotion, but a way to remove an overly persistent truth seeker from the district, he wrote a detailed internal memo to the sheriff. This document, which never became part of the official case file, systematically refuted the bear theory point by point. He listed the broken rifle, the impossible scratches at a height of 9 feet, the anatomically baffling footprints, the decapitation of the victim, and the deliberate theft of the head. At the end of his report, he wrote a line that would doom his career in that county. All the physical evidence we have indicates that Richard Collins was attacked and killed by a large, unknown predator, capable of both bipedal and quadrupedal movement. I cannot provide a rational explanation for this, but I am convinced, beyond any doubt, that it was not a bear. Before he left, he gave copies of his unofficial notes, including photographs of the plaster casts, to one person he trusted, a local journalist and regional historian who had been collecting folklore and strange stories from the region for decades. This journalist, teaming up with a retired biology professor from Traverse City University, began his own, quiet, unofficial investigation. They dug through archives and found a disturbing pattern. It turned out that every 7 to 10 years, events occurred in the region that stood out. In 1992, 2 tourists had reported to police that a huge creature had tried to tear the roof off their trailer at night. Deep scratches remained on the aluminum, chillingly similar to those found on the tree near Collins's death. In 1987, a farmer found 11 of his sheep dead, not eaten, just torn to pieces and scattered. The report blamed stray dogs, but the farmer swore he saw a dark, 2-legged silhouette on the hill that night. Finally, almost 5 years after the tragedy, the journalist tracked down an old trapper, a recluse named Frank, who lived in a remote cabin. Frank never spoke to authorities, but to the journalist who simply sat with him, he finally told his story. On January 15, 2000, the day Richard Collins died, Frank was checking his traps a few miles east of that very clearing. As dusk fell, the silence of the forest was shattered by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was not a roar or a howl. It was a furious, guttural roar, full of primal rage. Almost immediately, it was followed by a short, human scream that was cut off so abruptly it was as if the person had simply been gagged. Frank dove under the low branches of a fir tree, lying motionless. Minutes later, he saw it. A tall, dark figure moved between the trees. It walked on two legs, but its gait was stooping, inhuman. It was huge, and its silhouette stood out against the snow. And the detail Frank saw even in his nightmares was the profile of its head, an elongated snout, like that of a huge wolf or dog. It moved quickly, and in one hand, which looked like a human hand but was covered in dark fur, it carried something dark and round. It passed by and disappeared. Frank never told anyone. "Who would believe me?" he told the reporter. "They would lock me up." This story was never published. It, along with the detective's memo, explains why the authorities clung so stubbornly to the bear theory. Admitting the truth would mean admitting that the forests of a national park are home to something that has no name in zoology. Something strong, intelligent, and deadly. It would cause a panic impossible to control. It was easier to declare one rogue bear guilty and quietly bury the evidence. And that is what happened. The plaster casts were lost in transit. The detective's memo disappeared from the archives. The Richard Collins case gathers dust, a grim warning that there are places where man is not the apex predator, but merely prey.